Hello everyone, today we talk about Le Grand Querelle, so the great debates, the great theoretical wars, right, that reflected definitely the ones really fought on the European soil during the second half of the 18th century within the French military, right, the French strategic intelligentsia, so mostly generals of the time, regarding the reform, the military reform of the same Royal Army after the meager results during the War of Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, were essentially a net loss for the French. We will look at them in some other video, right? But that had posed this problem of how to reform, also doctrinally, the army. Of course, for a continental context, France was the hegemonic country in Europe since Louis XIV, and generally at this point things, of course, were changing. Think about the alliance with the Holy Roman Empire in the 7 Years' War was somehow a novelty, the changes at the time of Louis XV, etc. But that had to do with the essentially the reshaping. Right, these decisions, the debates, would trigger the reform of, in fact, one of the greatest armies at the time. The French military as the leading one, at least in terms of mass overall, because now we will talk essentially also the back and forth in terms of quality and power and rigor and, in fact, admiration of between the French and the German, namely the Prussian forces from, at this point, from the 18th to, actually till today to some degree. Of course, these are not the most preeminent military cultures in the world anymore, but until the 20th century, of course, they played an important role, and still we're talking about one nuclear power, and still the largest forces in continental Europe. And so what eventually shaped one another up to our day. I plan really to make a lot about French and German warfare between the 18th and the 20th century. I made a couple of videos last year, in fact, about the Bundeswehr and the French armed forces as well, contemporary times. And I plan to expand on that as well, because they are really interesting topics. Of course, I'm a medievalist. I don't know how you're going to react to this, not because I think that I'm inadequate to it, because I actually have a heavy background, fortunately, where to draw from, that I often didn't display. Rather, in terms of your tastes, surely there will be room for more people, say there will be more variety to the content. I don't plan to make Schwerpunkt just a now a prevalently contemporary or modern warfare channel. I'm a medievalist. I partially, let's say, also talk about what I do here in Mimetize and among the rest. Yeah, it's always useful to talk about the art of war, because as I explained ad nauseam, if you don't study military history diachronically and comparatively, it's useless to study it altogether. In any case, I think that the point of this channel, as also the avatar and the name show themselves, is about the development of this sense of strategic culture that at times passes through relatively simple things, because as von Clausewitz himself says, war in itself is very simple, right? There is not actually a major complication in the way it is waged per se, in the essentials, in the inherent relations between attack and defense, in the laws of reciprocity. Everything is pretty damn simple. And the reason why it's pretty damn simple is also that it's pretty damn hard, as everything in life, right? You know, the straightest way, the one that makes you achieve the best result, is definitely the one that requires greater force, right? Von Clausewitz himself, that is surely not a banal author about the subject matter, says that the actual secret of strategy is to be very strong, right? He literally says that. And of course, he takes a certain intelligence to concretely, and he goes on because he wrote after that and before that quite a bit also to explain. It's, as you know, the von Kriege and von Clausewitz's work as well is a great system, right? It's a great architecture. You cannot can't pick one quote or another without contextualizing it, right? But these statements are also very deep in meaning, philosophically, scientifically, morally, technically, etc., and they should be understood very well. And I think this suits today's topic because, as we will see, at least from one point of view, today we talk about doctrine mostly, so not all the issues of politics. That, of course, is the first one. How the French kingdom, the French Empire, managed to reform its army. It was a gigantic work. We will make other videos about this. So the organizational implications, the social ones, the financial ones, etc. The game of alliances and what was going on in the world, and so on. But doctrinally, which, however, makes you understand how apparently something so simple, right? The grand querelle between a line or column order, right, as a preferential attitude that, of course, could be switched during according to the needs, but this still would have had to represent the philosophical facies, let's say, of the French military, were really discussed to an important extent by hell of military minds to understand essentially what would have been the better option. And remember, if you have followed the von Kriege series, that von Clausewitz actually talks about how these things had gone in general, like not specifically referred. There are some names, of course, especially from the Prussian staff, the Prussian general, that really he could exemplify, right? But there was a great debate going on in 18th century Europe at so many levels. Just think about all the inventions, all the new means available. So it's always a matter of innovation, updating doctrine, how you can afford as a culture, as a civilization, as a people, to achieve this big result. And the French military, eventually this opens, of course, to the revolutionary times at some point. This is at least the basis, right, the excellent basis of the French Royal Army, over which the revolutionary Napoleonic reforms would graft later, and so representing actually the actually superior model, right, throughout the 19th century, right? Many people focus on, let's say it's Prussia that rises, right? So the 19th century, it's the Prussians. Well, technically not. I mean, in a global perspective, it's the French, in spite of their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, etc., that maintained during that century, and even in a minoritary part beyond, after the intuitions of the Clausewitzians and the German unification, like the rise of that Prussian hell, of course, a moral and scientific culture that von Clausewitz had generated. What was France, right? First of all, because it was a larger military as well, it had greater possessions. It was really from quite a while, from the time of Louis XIV. Think about the de Martinet, or that specifically terrestrial military culture, the faster pace, for example. It's a matter of how hard really this country that fundamentally had to attack and defend merely on this enormous land frontier in continental Europe had boosted its military from the top, also of a hell of a warlike tradition since the Middle Ages, and so it's a bit difficult to just picture this entirely. But that's why I want to really discuss it in great depth, in great length, because this is the infamous observation. But I don't think that people raised on YouTube in the last decades are actually, on average, cognitively qualified to understand what it means to evaluate the objective value of politics, of a country, of a people, of culture. Right? People just mostly go to their own personal preference, and we all do by some degree. But there is an objective history that is quite hardcore based. There, you can't quite an inch in a way or another. And this is why the sinusoidal trend between France and Germany must be pointed out here, because if we pick quality, there is no doubt either that until 1759, the best European army, right, in the 18th century, had been the Prussian one. By this point, I made last spring a couple of videos about Frederick the Great's reforms, insights, the development of the Prussian army. We'll keep talking about that hopefully soon. We explained why Prussia, that up to a few generations ago was objectively just a minor power, managed to rise to that primate, right? The Prussians by the mid-18th century were definitely well trained, optimally equipped, habituated to speedy maneuvers on the battlefield, and to conjugate, at best, both, as we've seen, cold steel, bayonet charges, and firepower in line. More of this coming now, because again, the videos I made are about Frederick's army are exactly about this topic, right? So there was all actually an evolution of 18th century warfare for which artillery increased a big deal, and let's say the way infantry in fact was employed changed accordingly. The important here being that this war machine allowed the King of Prussia to, or in Prussia as the Habsburgs preferred to call them, as they allowed him to be, to why in fact the Prussian realm with the two Silesian wars and to defend the former on 4 fronts during the 7 Years' War. Right, von Clausewitz there illustrates well in his most famous paradigm how, of course, you can have the best military, but you have to really hope that politically things go well, and the miracles of the House of Brandenburg are the proof again that you can have the best army, but sometimes it's also, and for all the greatest armies in history, it must be forcefully a matter of luck as well, right? It's never about just merit in absolute terms, right? Humanly, we can't quite achieve that, and especially in war. And there is a deep, say, almost metaphysical intuition in that I often refer to indirectly when I tell you about the balancement of the odds, when from a strategic point of view, especially. And that's all. It's enclosed in what politics decides, right? So it's crazy at a point. You know, how so many people can die in a war, but how that's still about forces that we can barely control, you know, in a fully rational, in an absolute way. In fact, does not exist. Hence the concept of absolute war that the Nazis improbably misinterpreted as total war, which, if anything, if you want to match it with absolute, is still what von Clausewitz gives as an impossibility in reality. In any case, there had been, of course, armies are products of the cultures that have put them together. So there had been very capable men in order to build such an effective system. The Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, the colonels Friedrich von Manstein, not Erich from the 20th century, Friedrich. These again are very famous names in Frederick's entourage in the first place. Alexander Hermann von Wartensleben, the generals Hans Karl von Winterfeldt, Heinrich August de la Motte-Fouquet, Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, Hans Joachim von Zieten. These are just the most famous names, by the way, and they all deserve actually a video. on their own. We'll talk about their work at some point, because aside from their actual deeds on the battlefield, because as you understand, these were all commanders, right? As I often explain, there actually are people like, that there are just theorists, there are military historians in this case, that are able eventually to be good commanders without having ever commanded, right? But it's rare. Right, how many coaches in sports do you know that weren't former athletes themselves in that discipline? Well, a few. Arguably very few compared to the others, but still, right? In any case, this was a time in which these people were... We're still talking about the Ancien regime, right? Don't exchange Frederick's Prussia for sort of a liberal, or just more enlightenment as a, the people are more important. No, the great part of the success of this system is that it stemmed from an incredibly primitive background, right? Frederick loved to say that some parts of Prussia were, less productive than Siberia. And he was actually right? So some areas were just covered in sand, but held the men that were bred there were the kind of people that could carry out this, manslaughter to a very high degree. And it's not just that, it's definitely the mind of such a great sovereign like Frederick. But if you read some of his biographies, you really understand how old-fashioned he actually was. I say that because I'm a great fan. I'm a great fan of Maria Theresa. I'm a great fan of Frederick the Great, but not in the Enlightenment myth of the thing, right? They were enlightened people, but still deeply ancien regime, deeply traditional in their way. So what happened after them is a bit the tragedy. These were the last great ones, right? That made, especially for this German world and its dependencies, namely, Poland, Hungary, mostly Bohemia, and more, made their states, right? We have observed how Germany, up to the 17th century, had been considerably, advanced at some levels, of art, culture, etc. But statally wise, civilizationally wise, they still had to take off compared to countries like France, etc. So Frederick the Great is a bit the guy who makes it, right? And again, the paradox of the Habsburgic and the Hohenzollern empires is that they are actually based on powers that, at least extensionally, are more outside of Germany than inside of it. But that worked as well. Again, these hybrids are very, very useful. I made a video also how the Habsburgs contributed, for example, to the reawakening of the Ukrainian national identities, kind of indirectly for them, because of course they would have not preferred, but at least they used that in against other problems. The rise of nationalism in other, think about Hungary, etc., within their system. That's a completely different story. But just bear in mind that these armies we're talking about are exactly the product of that political belief. These are not like the revolutionary armies. This has nothing to do with nationalism. Nationalism was a radical, leftistic, terroristic ideology based essentially on the lesser people, right? The commoners, right? This man, of course, would have spit in the face of such individuals. They couldn't care less. And they were actually right? And except, not all was great, like Frederick or Maria Theresa or others. So that's why the system collapsed, but not because of the worth of individual commoners or the average commoner of a single nation, right? That's an incredibly low level of human being from a personal, moral, cultural point of view that everybody should be ashamed. But hey, welcome to nationalism and or socialism that cannot exist without one another. 19th century states it's anti-tradition, anti-ancien regime, anti-worth and dignity of mankind. But it's a little detail. So France instead at this point was finding it really hard to come out of the impasse of the War of Austrian Succession. There had been doubts on the doctrines of employment, on armaments, on artillery materiel, on the employment of cavalry, etc., that would, by the way, be paid on the battlefield, right? And this helped definitely clarifying the situation at the cost of serious and often useless sacrifices, right? The French army continued along this painful path of degradation and decay until the 7 Years' War. You will say, well, but they actually, didn't perform particularly well during the 7 Years' War as well, etc. Well, yes, that was mostly a political and strategic issue. Here we're talking tactics, and things had, at this point, gone so bad that definitely red flags had been identified to the point the military was beginning to react, to theorize, to experiment, as we will see today. Right. So the times of Maurice de Saxe, Maurice of Saxony, of the Prince of Conti, and of François Chevert were over. We'll talk about these guys. I'm planning a video about Maurice of Saxony specifically. So you know that those were some times of the greatest glory of the French military. Think about Fontenoy, were in jarring contrast to battles like the one of Rosbach, for example. So the new French commanders had not proven to be at the same height of their predecessors. The moral and material qualities of the Royal Army had at this point reached sort of cracking point, or at least a dangerously low level. And especially the humiliation of Rosbach was the natural consequence of these deficits that were already... Again, you may have a very good system. Again, the entire bases are, of course, enormously costly. There is a work behind that. There is a state. There is a bureaucracy. But it's exactly often in the most elaborate systems that it's more difficult to update, right? Younger powers, at least initially, have this advantage because they can build things out of scratch, right? And so picking the best model and or succeeding, even sometimes with great difficulty, building up one as new, whereas much bigger powers like France have to have this internal resistance, right? We were just talking about the Swedes, say, during the 30 Years' War and later. We're talking about the Prussians in the following century. So the defeat of the Prince de Soubise in Germany, we're talking Rosbach here, marked, however, exactly for this reason, because France was a civilization and as such it was intelligent, the beginning of a true French military renaissance, thanks to which it began a deep and especially well thought out reform of the army that can be considered as important in scale like the one of Saint Louis XIV and of Louvois. 1 century before, I made a video that is titled Ballet, Lace, and Bloodbath, where it is splendid war of the Sun King, which illustrates like the enormous difficulties, the enormous achievement, right, just of Louis XIV and his impressive personnel, right, the great commanders, great thinkers, great administrators. So you want to appreciate that, right, because these countries were, at the end of the day, even though they in fact managed to pull it off in some fashion in terms of their survival, even in times of crisis. I mean, think about even the French Revolution. They had always been under the threat of annihilation. I mean, France, yes, you say, well, Louis XIV wanted to conquer Europe like Napoleon would. Well, yes, but the alternative was being conquered, right? So that you had at best to find a balance, an equilibrium. Right, the enemies of Napoleon marched on Paris, The enemies of Louis XIV did not march on Paris. So you must think what that means even in a history of civilization. Now, the improvements of the reform can be followed day by day. They're also importantly documented, right? Consider the times and the places. Because also, as we've seen, the French command really involved themselves a lot, also because it was a matter of honor. It was about what had been their accomplishment. These had been all officers, involved with the previous disasters, etc. And at that point, specifically in 7 Years' War, as we were observing, such progress that had started was not, however, so rapid to overthrow the outcome of the war for France, that was, as you know, involved literally all over the world. Some say this was like the First World War proper, and that in fact it ended in kind of the worst of ways, right? France in the 7 Years' War was humiliated on the European battlefields. It's not that she hadn't displayed or she hadn't owned good quantity and even quality of forces, right? But evidently things would go really bad. Also overseas, the colonies were disrupted, as you know, so you start seeing really the British Empire rising as the first world power. The second one in absolute military terms was the Chinese Empire, telling you the truth. Because up to this point, that in absolute amount of forces, the Chinese had remained as a single imperial force larger than European ones. But at this point, you have, of course, of a single European one. Of course, Europe had already surpassed China abundantly, but one single power, single European power, that's when it happens. It's with the British at the end of the 7 Years' War, and mostly because of their accomplishments at sea. What had happened on the continent, of course, was at the hands of the Prussians, mostly. So, there are other, interesting considerations. Some miracles of the House of Brandenburg had occurred also because France had not had properly the will. I made a video on the concept of wanton victory from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, and it's always valid for any war because it's all about moral forces. Like, it was quite costly for the French to be able to march up to Berlin, right, and to go fight in Silesia, right? That's something that you have to respond to a public opinion that is forming in France. I made videos about the contrast between the nobility and bourgeoisie regarding the French officers' appointments, so the career problems, again, minutiae compared to what France could do, but exactly what oriented the country to unsatisfactory outcome compared to its potential. Again, mostly it's also about leadership. It's also about the single choices taken by the government, by single commanders, by the king, etc. And it's a very complex topic. So I never made a video about the 7 Years' War, but at least in as such. And so I think that's also a good idea for another, for one, multiple, of course. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, we see, also because all these people had come home, a very intense debate on how to improve the French army. Doctrine of employment, tactics, material, organization, training, they were now worked on to be standardized, first of all, and rendered common throughout the entire armée. This was a preliminary condition, because if you do not have homogeneous forces, you cannot also reason in terms of adequate doctrine and thinking it to be applicable in every situation. Same goes for for anything, for materiel, for discipline, and so on. So that was still a matter of great work for the time, especially for such a large force like the French. So there were, to this end, some summer maneuvers that basically brought together entire divisions, during which a stronger discipline was imposed to the troops, to the point that the French Expeditionary Corps in North America in 1780 and in 1781 actually deeply impressed anyone, right? Friends, enemies, and we will talk about that during the War of American Independence. I made a video about that, but we didn't talk about the French much, just per se, the quality of their military, but it was dramatically advanced. We're not talking, of course, just about the newly born American army, but in general, like just in front of the world. And again, there was all a tradition to live up to as well. There was, however, regarding this entire reform, the most important problem at the root. That is the adequate doctrinal application through, in fact, an established theory shared by the reformers that had to operate that unitarily, as we've seen. And this practically revolved around, as I said before, the line, the choice between the line and the column. So these are basic tactical formations, and in linear tactics what they practically mean. Never made a video about linear tactics, but I think people are hopefully acquainted to the cold logic that standard way of war among Europeans, at least, and especially, well, pretty much everywhere, but especially for the wars that mattered the most, that were the ones in the old continent, so where greater forces were concentrated, and so where this doctrinal differences would make the greatest impact on, in fact, a continental warfare that is at this point de facto standardized, right? There's no difference between countries, if not regarding the quality, quantity, doctrine, etc., but the way they fight is really the same. So, of course, the aforementioned differences are crucial for armies like this. I mean, there had been of course, there had been a reason for the Prussians, let's say, to boost dramatically the quality of their own armies, tactically, because they were literally risking annihilation, right? So the moral force triggered by this metus hostilis had been invested, had provided Frederick the Great with the means to pump into that into the military, and in a relatively truly backwards country, also as far as military tradition was concerned. And so you have there especially the intelligence of such an ethereal and smart guy like Frederick that played an important role. So when the French were thinking what would be the best doctrine to employ for an army like France, so with all the strategical and operational needs that France had compared, it was different from any other country. The debate, of course, was mostly about this. You had either to favor essentially firepower, so exploiting the line, and attritional fighting through, in fact, volley after the other, and column that was mostly about movement, hopefully also bayonet attack, that was, of course, not so frequent as, in fact, just like linear tactics really say, as say, musketry fire. I mean, the greatest amount of deaths in 18th century warfare came from musket balls, then cavalry swords, then bayonets, then artillery. Even though cavalry did kill also after during the pursuit, so you have to consider in which times of the the battle, not necessarily during combat, right? Which is very important. So of course, most of the formation was about infantry, and line and column were, for this reason, the main mean, right? The main formation that you had to rely on. There was also open order, etc. But we're talking about heavy infantry, right? So not skirmishers, etc. That there is cavalry, etc. But that's minor, as we've seen, to break the enemy formations. So the prevalence was for the line, and as we'll see, that's also where the French would settle for. But column was, seducing for different reasons. First of all, moving a formation in column makes things faster, right? So let's leave aside for now the comparison with the Prussians. That is not just entirely also about mobility equates just bayonet attacks, melee, etc. It's also still about how you move troops throughout, even in line, how you make them advance, if so, during the fire exchange. As we've seen, the Prussians did something that seemed almost suicidal, and that was again driven by a traumatically bloodthirsty discipline that rendered such things possible and happening. Battlefields, as we've seen, were incredibly messy, so most of the theory on the battlefield was, not abandoned, because the theory still contemplated what would happen in those cases, but it was definitely not something like precision fire, for example, or even looking literally at the target, right, during battles, especially after the first volley. So much of training, as far as especially fire exchange was concerned, was just about that crazy mechanical, immediate cognitive capacity of just performing those maneuvers of loading, unloading repeatedly like crazy to essentially overpower the enemy in that exchange. So much so that troops were trained, of course, to be precise when shooting in peacetime, but they were also trained to make this kind of crazy, continuous shooting, the mad minute at some point, the British would call it, that of course drastically reduced, to say the least, any kind of precision. But it would have been more useful to just have sort of encoded in your mind when, especially with all the mess around, the smoke, the shots. It's very loud. It's very confusing and disorienting. And that's why you had to get habituated as much as you could, because that's what would have happened on a battlefield. Plus, people die all around you, right? So that's a very important thing. Naturally, much of the debate between line and column stemmed from the standpoint of maneuver as well, right? How do you want the troops to approach to come at useful range for fire exchange, and then thinking about the attrition, and or whether you want to gap that distance just with a bayonet attack. Well, it's obvious that at different troops were trained, right, to perform both, styles to form in the different formations, and with such arrays, maneuvering and engaging, etc. But there had to be a preliminary orientation towards one of the two, for especially the largest armies, right? Because you can find, of course, single tactical situations in which, again, it's better to switch from one to another. There, you need, of course, great autonomy on the lower ranks. For example, the Prussians had, generally speaking, had this kind of intuition. It's something that will be maintained, developed also later in the at the basis of we can call the Clausewitzian reforms of the 19th century. Without, of course, there are very different things. The Prussian army gets annihilated by the French in 1806, but it's a completely different world, right? When there were of course, different views on this. The same Napoleon, when arriving at Potsdam on Frederick the Great's grave, said to his staff, like, salute him, because if he had been still alive, we wouldn't be here. So there was a general sense, of course, that you can't keep on updating things. But of course, the Prussian staff of 1806 was already crystallized in that confidence that Frederick had provided to Prussian military culture, to the point of saying, there is nothing that can destroy us at that point. So just bear in mind that these things are this fast and this somehow difficult to change. And so great disasters can happen literally from a day to another, just like this. So coming back to the French, the battlefield experience seemed to pretend infantry formations linearly deployed on 3 ranks. That was a standard. You may think it's very very short depth, but it's actually not, because that's how firepower had, developed to the point of managing to stop, to discourage, let's say, for example, a cavalry charge that could definitely break those ranks, but still suffering too many losses in the process, differently from whichever tactical opportunity would have presented if a section of the entire line would have collapsed through attrition, infantry charges, etc. And it was still all about combined arms, right? And even more advancedly so, and even more powerfully so, because technologies were providing with unprecedented firepower, as we've seen, especially as far as artillery was concerned. Now, the linear system, just as it was normal, had the advantage to provide a practically continuous fighting front without gaps, right? So I made an entire video a couple of years ago to explain what we mean by gaps in warfare, right? There are lots of people who believe that gaps between units that exist in any line, in any battle line, are somehow a place where other units could allegedly enter and create that's not how it works at all, right? Even if the gap was large as much as an entire unit, that doesn't bring you any advantage of sort. When we talk about gaps in the enemy lines to exploit, we're talking about things like, an entire battle line or an entire front line of an army half, and breaking in half and, say, leaving a very large space for, say, an entire cavalry charge to attack on the flank or the rear, things like that. And that's also relatively rare in military history. Gaps exist in every battle line because every unit must operate at a certain distance on the side from one another, and that little gap is for nobody to exploit, because it literally would have, first of all, to squeeze the unit into it, and or starting to fight even against the two sides of the units at a time, breaking your own cohesion. So you could try to do that, but eventually how this battle tactics had formed, like since the dawn of warfare, were always about losing at that point your own frontal power, frontal punch. I mean, it's not a proof of strategic superiority to avoid frontal attacks, right? There is not a shortcut in warfare for saying, okay, we have to do this without literally smashing the enemy front. And the enemy front knows the enemy is not stupid; it's going to be frontally turned towards you, right? And you create there just a situation that does not even allow you to operate orderly, and given free, say, full use to your military potential. In any case, what here, in fact, this concept of linearity means is that with a density of 3 men in depth, every square meter of an army of 60,000 men, even with gaps that are designed also in terms of distance on the base of that sort of how much you can cover with firepower even laterally, could occupy a combat front of 13 kilometers. Right, and you know that at this point, for everybody who has had a map of a 7 years war battle, is very extended. Right, this did pose some problems, right? You could, of course, obviate to that, to the fact that it's very difficult to coordinate the movements of the entire line. You could dispose, for example, of a second reserve line, so you halve in the front, you get to 6.5 kilometers, and so at that point you would have had even a greater control of the camp, and of course you would calibrate this ad hoc in every battle to the degree of enemy concentration wherever you thought you were. So of course the various lines could be more composite, right? The line implied a combat based on firepower as such. The reason why you have all these guys frontally so is again that firepower is so thick and great along this line that the only way to try to compromise satisfactorily the entire line solidity is to wear it out on a long front, so that you can cause collapses of entire chunks of this line, not creating little gaps that again are very difficult to exploit with single, for example, cavalry units or even with infantry units. That's important as much as the length is, because, as we said, you may have different outcomes of different ends of the battle line that you're not going to exploit easily, right? Through communications, and everything again is here. It's how you deploy them, right? And what it's going to happen in the battle, you can never foresee easily, right? Unless you're a really military genius, but still there are lots of question marks, right? You cannot know. You can't hope to make things tending towards a direction. But whether that will happen or not is also a matter of what the other guy does from the other side. So it's not a passive target. There is always a low reciprocity again. So in this deployment, every soldier, every musketeer was virtually capable of pointing the gun and shooting against the enemy. Yet again, for even a higher commander, managing a linear front of even just 6.5 kilometers was very difficult, right? And as a consequence, also the tactical mobility of the units was scarce, because you didn't have, again, a reserve that is crucial in times of linear tactics. And so if you go for, let's say, a lost enterprise, you're still essentially not replaceable on that line, right, when you abandon it. So this, in turn, renders more difficult the exploitation of those favorable situations that could form on the battlefield, right? If you don't have a reserve, right, you can't, because the obvious logic is that that unit that has been in the first line shooting is also too spent just to do much else afterwards. And you can have very good units that can, carry out even for example, a bayonet charge after the fire exchange. But the value of the reserve there is crucial, as much as even an importantly larger force that is, however, spent is practically at some point even exhausted. It cannot, after a protracted fight, to the advantage of a fresh one, even maybe a smaller one, a more orderly one, a less, again, depressed one, a less suffering one, and so on, right? So all of this made the French think, of course, of the alternative of the column, because let's say what can we do about that? How to which point can we establish reserves in order to exploit the tactical situation, right? So there are lots of books. By the way, the main authors here we are Puisegur, Follard, François-Jean de Ménil-Durand, Joly de Mézeroy, etc. These are say all important names, and many officers, taking in consideration the teachings of these figures, advised the adoption of more aggressive tactics. based in fact on column, in French the ordre profond, so the deep order, right? And so with consequent bayonet attack that they had, of course, also learned, right, finding, say, to the Prussian degree, fighting against the Hohenzollern. And there were some advantages too in certain situations. First of all, of course, linear tactics is designed for somehow tidy, civilized European battlefields and so on. But even on these, you can find a broken terrain. And of course, especially an enemy that is defending will exploit that. And so if you count on, say, for example, a situation in which you are inferior in number, but you're higher in morale, right? If you start exchanging firepower, let's say at parity of training, and so of frequency of how fast you pour that lead on the enemy, you're going to take too many casualties, right? That are not are not going to be let's say justifiable in that context. Now the ironic and non-ironic thing of this is that the Prussians, as we've seen, were so obsessed with order that they preferred to take casualties in the process of course, advancing against the enemy to resolve the matter with cold steel, but to that pace that would be fixed to certain situations, exactly because order was the most important thing. And so when you arrived against the enemy line, the more compact you were, and the more chances you would have had to break it. And of course, the more casualties you take, and the more that can get compromised. But that's exactly where the balance was. Some criticize even several instances in which Prussian infantry had just marched that same step against the enemy for the point of not breaking formation, because that was their pride. They preferred to die like that than breaking the ranks and charging more disorderly. And this is also a bit like an extreme, because what we actually see on 18th century battlefields, aside from makeup, wigs, etc., and so this whole sort of fantassin, sort of toy soldier, lead soldier, millimetric orders, that actually these forces broke ranks quite often in order to seize favorably tactical situation. Right? They were just disrupted very often by the same enemy fire. Things would disorder themselves quite easily, etc. So especially those armies that were not so obsessed on that sense of discipline at all costs, at least for the mere solidity of the formation in a geometrical sense, were just more prone. This could happen even within the same armies, depending on the unit, to fight in that clumsier way. And there was, of course, an important tactical insight in the idea of column, of the deep order, bayonet attack, that is to that aggressive degree correct, meaning that, again, if you have that power and capacity, you can definitely gap the distance with an enemy that surely is not going to cause you more casualties than if you stand just in front of him, just exchanging volleys for a very long time during that combat. The problem is that what happens at a closer range is much more intense, both in the time you take to approach without shooting, or maybe shooting but still, again, lengthening the time under fire, and that definitely what happens when you get to cold steel. And these people, again, were completely habituated to the sense of disemboweling a person in front of them without too many problems. They were soldiers. They weren't normal people. I mean it in a positive sense, being that actually the military has a higher IQ than the rest of the population. That the sheer brutality and what they were habituated to, this was not the worst that could happen, but it still requires some guts, not just to spill, meaning that. Of course, it takes really a lot of determination, at least, to see that also insightful, because there are bayonet charges that fail too. So that's not simply, okay, so we attack, and who are you to attack another line? Yes, you can have a deeper order, and so you can, say, break that guy if the unit is deployed again on it's less concentrated because it's more diluted on a single line, but a single line can outflank you, can envelope your formation. So there are different issues with that. It's a purely mathematical problem. Now the interesting thing is that it's exactly in the measure it's a purely mathematical problem. There's not just mathematics in war. So what the theory and doctrine was looking at was exactly what happens more likely given these standards of training that you could apply and the ones that the enemy had as well. So this is essentially what the doctrinal debates stood like. Because of course everybody was trained to practice both linear and column formation tactics. There was the sense, of course, that in a column you are also closer to a greater number of comrades, right? Because you don't have them just on the side, but also on the rear, and they can intervene just straight away, not from a line that disperses itself on a longer distance. So, of course, this was yet one of the advantages of the column, especially during the most intense and difficult moments of the battle. So that if you had a reserve, in fact, that's the one that had hopefully, and the enemy hadn't. That's what if the enemy had it, this was the extrema ratio and putting up another fight. If the enemy didn't, well, it could really be the tip of the balance in that mess. So the opponents of the column, doctrinally, such as, for example, the Count Hippolyte de Guibert, believed that such column formation was too vulnerable to artillery fire. And that's definitely, from a frontal point of view, true. I mean, doctrinally, the prevalence of the line, we've seen it in the video about Frederick's artillery, of course, privileged the sense that an oblique fire, right, to exploit the width of the line. So ideally, something that had to approach the very side of the enemy formation would cause more casualties, right? But if you concentrated, of course, more people in a row, in a column, well, the enemy that shot from the front had more chances, if hitting the column, to kill multiple people at a time. And we know, of course, of sometimes lucky shots that, throw into pieces dozens of people. And this did happen, of course. There were, for example, some anecdotes. One is, we find it in at least in the memories of the Lieutenant Colonel Downman, who commanded the fire of a British battery in the Battle of Santa Lucia in the Western Indies on December the 15th, 1778. And he said, firing on the French, I found myself in an excellent situation to molest French infantry while they marched attacking, disposed in column. Right, I could hit them with ease while they were deploying, when they had deployed, and also when they retreated. I developed the most intense bombardment that I could against their flank that was presented to me for the greater part of the action. My hits in this situation killed dozens at every shot, and there were on the ground so many of those French heads and legs as many heads and legs of sheep in Scotland, right? This comes from a horror movie scene, but that's literally what happened, and it tells you, of course, a bunch of interesting things. First of all, columns were not vulnerable just from the front, but also from the side. The guy says I was shooting down on the side because that's the one that was mostly exposed. to me. So you see that not always, of course, you have perfect linearity and symmetry going on, but the fact, even if there were more ranks, right, it was also easier to hit that into that depth of ranks from the side, right? You would have still the, say, a usual. We'll see how big these columns were normally in depth and in width, but let's say it was just easier to hit such a deeper formation in the first place, right? Also, you realize that the continuity of this, right? The fact that sometimes you did here there were more. Say it depends on the situation. It's obvious that closer battlefields are more complicated for the attacker, right? But right, also the fact that this is not just a thin line, but it's something deeper, and not as thin in width as in depth compared to the line. It's not a reverse, right? Is more important because these columns were not again columns of 2 or 3 lines, right? They were substantially larger. So this looks more similar to, as we'll see now, a sort of Renaissance pike square than a column as we intended, just for the sake of march that sometimes was used exactly for that purpose. But still, there is the point of redeployment as well at some point. As you know, during the Revolutionary Wars, there's this idea that the French had a mixed order because they would use columns and lines in a sort of interspersed way. Absolutely not, right? The point was that there was still the French Royal Army that were professionals fighting for revolutionary France. At that point, the army remained as the one of the state. Plus, there were lots of new conscripts now because of the mass army of equality also in conscription. And those guys were considerably less capable of moving in line than the professionals. So they were left in reserves as columns, so that when the lines of the professionals would, say, get thinner because of fire attrition, they would run to pick their place, but they wouldn't operate in that sense, you know. Then, of course, you find every kind of arrangement depending on the situation. But here we're talking about the general theory and principle that was important just to have ready on a battlefield orientatively, and then for the commander to decide how to employ this or not. And it's interesting that they were debating the issue of the column just in terms of the degree of training and aggressiveness that it was required in general to have that kind of attitude, to be able even to advance that speedily and hopefully decisively on the battlefield, right? So it was thinking quite big, definitely. But doctrine is also not just a matter of opinion. You have this stuff to work. The defensors of the ordre means, so the opposite of profond means meager, right? Thin. So the line, in fact, stated that the latter suffered less of artillery fire. And as experience demonstrated through some tactical trick, you could further reduce losses in a meaningful way. For example, at the Battle of Hochkirch, because again, the aside from the fact that you experienced that, but again, the enfilade fire on a line could again cause lots of losses from the side as well, right? So compared to what Downman explained, by firing on a column from the side, though not from the front, the idea is that if he had shot on a line, aside from the reason why that French unit in that episode was firing a column, let's skip this, but it would have been easier, right, for this line to essentially reduce losses once starting to be under fire. And at Auchkirch, and you know, this military historians as commanders had noticed that the Prussian rearguard managed to save themselves from the intense Austrian fire, essentially carrying out a series of evasive maneuvers. That is, quote, as soon as the cannon shot centered the line of the regiment, a movement, either right or left, was ordered so that the shots could fall either too long or too short. Right, the retreat was thus carried out according to a sort of zigzag movement. Right, here you have yet another situation in which, of course, still on 3 ranks, you can have important losses if the enemy artillery from the front is able to adjust its ballistics to know that more or less you can hit these people. So what you can do at that point is, if you have enough room laterally, you can simply move left and move right, and so at that point artillery has to recalibrate, the shot has to sometimes even move, and so by shifting, right, and the formation, you can put maybe the enemy crewmen a bit in crisis for that, if they are targeting you specifically, because there wasn't much of artillery fire compared to, again, the larger masses of troops. So you would think, but what if all artillery was concentrated on you? Well, at that point it would have been a bit more complicated. But remember that artillery was not used, first of all, to cause losses, rather to disrupt the enemy formation, and it was normally concentrated in, say, at the beginning of the battle in the front lines, right? So in this case, you can imagine even at a greater distance the rear guard being targeted also at, more episodically, excuse me, at the end of the battle, or in other non-opening circumstances. In any case, yes, losses were there, and that problem was never fully surpassed, but again, that was not the most important thing. It was more important how the infantries interfaced one another. Now, the French columns proposed had different dimensions that went from enormous masses of soldiers, entire divisions of 6,400 men, right? So we're, again, literally talking about something more similar to the Swiss or Landsknecht's squares of the 16th century than what you had been habituated to see. In fact, mostly in a linear formation in the 18th, up to smaller so-called attack columns in the French works, formed by 912 men with a front of 76 and 12 ranks deep. They're still pretty large, right? But that was also the point, right? When you are, of course, opting, if you have that capacity to attack, that doesn't depend entirely, again, on what you wish, right? Again, what happens on, especially in a larger engagement, is a condition of tendential symmetry. Even though warfare is always asymmetric by definition, but the larger engagements have very balanced odds. So at that point, linear formation would be still the most convenient. It was difficult to argue that linear formation here would have been just superseded by columns, right? It was not conceivable, because the concept of front and how you could deliver firepower was unitly and would be understood to be more effective. What they counted in creating that disparity, of course, locally with the columns, but still subtracting those men from a more linear, let's say, from the line, which could be equally threatening for envelopment, flank attack, and you definitely had seen that during, at least the oblique order from the Prussians, creating problems of that kind. You can have all the columns where you want, maybe even more ready to intervene in certain situations, but still definitely having problems once they have broken through to actually reorder, and to, at that point, responding still to an enemy that is in a line. Doesn't matter what's the angle there, but you have to still remaneuver, reform the array, etc., and that's very complicated to do, if not, in fact, unadvisable on a battlefield. In fact, the ultimate solutions here are evident. Because at the beginning, the debate remained confined to pamphlets and theoretical volumes. That is to say, somebody began to write about this and they said, what do we do about it? I mean, these were opinions that existed around, and was no official, of course, connection aside from, say, the personal aristocratic, or even the bourgeois did participate in this, but I mean, it was about circles, ideas like single houses, etc., talking, right? But those who ran the Armée Royale, that were in part the same authors, decided in 1776 to adopt completely the Prussian manual that was used at the time. This is fascinating because they, first of all, attributed great relevance to what the Prussian achievements that they had also suffered of during the 7 Years' War had been theorized like, right? And because, in fact, this Prussian regulation emphasized the movements in line and firepower, as we've seen. And even though Prussia was also quicker to bayonet charges, of course, the preponderant tactic was about that linear firepower. And on the basis that this adoption was quite important, not just because of course, the copy from the other country, that was still, however, no mystery to anyone. This booklets circulate. I mean, again, that was not the point. The point is deciding, again, whether that is good for the French or not. And in fact, after this adoption, there is all an experimental phases. For example, 2 years later, in 1778, there were various experiments with 30,000 soldiers that were concentrated in the camp of Vasseux, that is also close to Bayeux, just for medieval history lovers, in Normandy, where, subdivided into, say, counterposed armies, they simulated a battle against one another, of course in some condition of symmetry, and for this reason they began to play with the line and the column. An army would use the linear tactics. The other instead was maneuvering column. Now, what is fascinating about this sort of reenactment is that the results were somehow controversial. First of all, because it was not a real battle, so proving the point that I always make about reenactment, that in many ways it's useless. For as far as that, as far as strategic culture is actually concerned. But it was understood, at least because these were soldiers and those who commanded them had seen war, etc., that, of course, the column moved much faster than the line. It's just easier to have a narrower front. The guy just has to follow the guy in front of him. You don't have to care about the alignment of the front, like on the line, more, for which you have to stop if one unit advances too fast and the other does, like we've seen it in the Prussian army as well. But once the front line was reached, so the formations reached the useful range for it was fire from the side of the line, and for, in theory, now the column to charge with a bayonet, or at least to engage in a general sense, like with that formation, the units deployed in line demonstrated a decisively superior firepower than the ones deployed in column. So this again could was complicated by the fact that they didn't kill each other, so they didn't know how it would have gone, but it was evident. It was a sort of reconfirmation. It was a way to settle the debate in some way, right? But they realized, of course, that linear formations were capable of inflicting greater damage overall to the enemy lines, even if some of these had essentially proceeded with a formation in depth that aimed at essentially breaking the enemy ones, right? So this was essentially what settled the matter, and just, of course, battlefield experience, because of course now there would be more before. Here we are, with the French about to intervene in the War of American Independence. Like you have essentially a more, of course, concrete assessment of what was, generally speaking, already known, right? But the fascinating thing is that they may have not known the degree, and they wanted to experiment that because they cared so much about that that result. And you start seeing that there is the beginning of also theoretical confidence as far as the application of tactics is concerned, right? We are, again, a few decades away from the Funkriege, and so that gap between, let's say, Renaissance manuals that just wrote, ideally, thinking to adopt Greek or Roman tactics for armies that just by themselves work in a completely different way, began to evaluate problems that would have increasingly been eventually taught as a matter of practice from the in a way to, at least the way von Clausewitz of course explains this, not surely in the sense of internal lines like Jomini, but in a fashion that can help at least the officer in command with a theoretical insight of what would go on, and that eventually, however, has to learn through sheer practice, as it kept happening, because war is not predictable, and no AI or whatever will ever be able to sort that out, especially better than what a human can, right? So, and I'm very confident about this, meaning that there is something there that is acquired just as a feeling and not as a pure rationalization. Also because it's unachievable. But pure rationalization would also have to take into account the entirety of reality, and that's not quite the case per se. But we will see this stuff at some other point. And I'm glad we began this this observation, because there's not much action in a video like this, but still, right? The concerns of those who had seen a lot of action regarding this matters, of course, were materialized in this fashion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.